So today we're going to be specializing or emphasizing our royal trumpet and our lion's mane, two of our favorites. And I actually didn't pay much attention to the royal trumpet before. It was my parents' favorite when they were alive. They loved them on the grill, and I'll talk more about that later. But I had their history completely wrong. And it turns out they have a very interesting history with humans that I did not know about before I dove in. Oh, silence your phones if you would.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, very distracting. I don't mind if you have them out, take pictures, but if somebody's phone rings, it just is distracting.
Okay.
So here's what I'm going to talk about today. Some disclaimer slides, because who doesn't need some disclaimer slides? Why everyone should be eating some mushrooms every day. We're going to dive into lion's mane, and it's similar to a talk I gave in Belgium a couple of years ago. I did a deep dive into lion's mane, and it turns out that it's really caught the popular imagination for something that's really good for your brain. And I'll go into that a little bit more. And I'm going to talk about royal trumpet, Phillips Origii. And this one has many names. We call it royal trumpet here. So first disclaimer slide. Here's what I am. I'm a mycologist. I study the fifth kingdom of fungi. Technical director here at Phillips Mushroom Farm, which means I do whatever I'm directed. And an unashamed mushroom geek. Here's what I'm not. A doctor, a pharmacist, or any sort of medical professional. But I do spend a fair amount of time diving deeply into the literature on nutritional and medicinal benefits of mushrooms. And I've just been watching a documentary series on ancient remedies for modern diseases. And on like the third session, they were talking about mushrooms for cognitive issues. And they made the bold statement that Western Europeans, like, I get my East and my West mixed up, but like Russians, Ukrainians, whatever, they're in charge in London now because they eat a lot of mushrooms. And Britons don't eat a lot of mushrooms. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I'm not going to go into today. But the world is really split into mycophobic people, people who are afraid of mushrooms, and microphilic people, people who love mushrooms. And there's a long, interesting history of that as well. What is a mushroom? You wouldn't think you'd have to ask this question, but spending quite a bit of time in DC doing regulatory work, we have to define mushrooms, otherwise we're trying to regulate animals as mushrooms, yeast as mushrooms, mushrooms as yeast, mushrooms as animals. It's just a big hot mess. So a mushroom is a fungus that produces a macroscopic fruiting body. And all that means is that it produces something big enough that you can pick up with your hand and see with your eyes. So while not all mushrooms are fungi, not all fungi are mushrooms. Of course, everyone knows who geek is. We totally want that costume. I put this up here because I love the picture. It's got it all, cats and mushrooms. But to show you the state of the science and why it's so exciting to be a mushroom scientist right now. So there are 150,000 to 160,000 described species of about 500,000 to 10 million fungi. Look at the range there. The fact is we don't know. So if you take a teaspoon of forest soil, there might be a mile of mushroom mycelium in there, which is the plant of the mushroom. We don't know what it is, what it's doing there. We just don't know. But as proteomic methods get better, we're learning more and more about what's actually in the soil. That produce fruiting bodies that are large enough to be considered mushrooms. We've named about 12,000 so far. 7,000 are edible, but some of them you're like, why would you possibly want to eat that? And some are great medicinals, but not very edible unless you process them in some way. 2,000 medicinal, and 2,700 possess proven therapeutic potential. But there are cultures that collect and eat about 300 different species of mushrooms, regularly used as food and medicine. So there's a long tradition of this with humans. So what we know about mushrooms and their benefits, what we know we don't know, and what we don't know that we don't know. The fact is there's just so much that we don't know, but worse than that, Marie Antoinette said, there's nothing new except what has been forgotten. And we're finding this to be true as we look into the history of use of mushrooms by humans, which goes back at least I think the latest archaeological evidence is like 870,000 years or something. So it goes back a really long time. So mushrooms are delicious food, and they're beautiful. Functional food and medicine. And all functional food is something that gives you benefits beyond what you see on the nutritional label. So if you're a label reader like me, you don't really get much information. You get carbohydrates, fiber, protein. It doesn't really tell you much about what's good in an apple or good in a mushroom. So to me, all whole food is functional food because you get more out of a whole food than they can possibly put on the label. And everyone knows this, right? Let food be thy medicine, medicine be thy food. And I think when I see that, I've always been a little over-medicated. I like this approach better. An Ayurvedic proverb, I have a hard time pronouncing that word, but I think I got it right that time. With the right food, medicine is of no need. With the wrong food, medicine is of no use. Because we know we turn ourselves over at least once a year. So you have to provide your body and your cells with the material and the environment that they need to do that accurately and completely. The oldest written record that we found so far of mushrooms as medicine is an Indian medical treatise from 3000 BC. And interestingly enough, I was recently talking to an Ayurvedic practitioner, an Ayurvedic medical practitioner, and she said that Indian medical practice does not use much mushrooms anymore. And the reason for that is, of course, that they were colonized by the Brits, and that knowledge was broken. And the Brits' traditional use of fungi was broken by being occupied by the Romans. And the Romans had very mixed feelings about mushrooms, but we're going to talk more about that when we get into the royal trumpet. So, anybody recognize this guy? Paul Stamets, the king of the mushroom geeks. Even his hat is made of mushrooms. So he asks this question. What single drug can benefit you by supporting and strengthening your immune system, providing anti-inflammatory properties, providing antioxidant properties, restricting blood vessel growth feeding tumors, causing programmed cell death of cancer cells, providing antiviral effects, restricting the growth of pathogenic bacteria, and assisting conventional anti-cancer drugs to work more effectively at lower doses? Of course, the answer is there's no single drug can do that. All mushrooms do those things to different degrees. Some mushrooms are better at some of them than others, but all mushrooms do all of those things to different degrees. He said that in a TED Talk he gave, I believe, in 2011, which is well worth a watch if you're interested in learning more. He gives a wonderful talk. So I have a whole series of slides here from Dr. Bob Beelman, who is, I think I wrote down his title here. Maybe I didn't. He's a man well into his 80s, a retired professor from Penn State, who's still going strong. And he let me use his slides. I go to visit him when I'm in central Pennsylvania. So he started the Center for Excellence for Plant and Mushroom Nutrition. So he's still well into his 80s and still doing a lot of really good work. So in the past, we mostly sold mushrooms for what they didn't contain, right? There's no cholesterol. They're low in fat. They're low in sodium, low in calories, low glycemic index, and they don't have gluten. We get this question a lot. They are gluten-free. The only caveat to that is some of our substrates contain gluten. So if you have a friend that you're feeding or a relative that's really sensitive to gluten, make sure you just trim them really well. They don't get any substrate in your mushrooms. Mushrooms don't pick up gluten and they do not contain gluten. Slowly we discovered mushrooms contain healthy things. And I've been in the industry long enough and I'm old enough to have seen this happen. They're a good nutritional source of B vitamins, potassium and selenium, fiber, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, protein, umami, this fifth sense of taste, immune enhancers in the form of beta and alpha glucans, cholesterol-lowering compounds, ergosterol, which in the presence of sunlight gives you vitamin D, and ergothioneine and glutathione, which I'm going to talk more about. And if you're going to nod off, that's probably when you're going to nod off, but try not to because it's really important. So fiber. Mushrooms have the highest fiber content of any food on a dry weight basis, both soluble and insoluble. So that's important for a lot of reasons, but if you get really excited about mushrooms today and you go home and eat a pound of raw white mushrooms, your friends and family will regret it. You'll have the worst gas you've ever had in your life and drive your nearest and dearest away. And I always recommend cooking your mushrooms because the major cell wall of mushrooms is chitin, which is the same as in insect exoskeletons and shrimp shells. We don't digest it very easily. So cooking breaks that down and it releases the really important other nutritional and medicinal benefits of mushrooms. So I always recommend cooking your mushrooms. And also, if you're not used to eating a lot of mushrooms, start slowly, because your body's microflora and microfauna will adapt to the mushrooms, and you'll have an increase in your beneficial gut microbiome and a decrease in the ones that aren't so good for you. So it really is modulates your gut microbiome. Cook your mushrooms. This is one of my favorite things to do. My husband and I in the summer, a nice portobello, your favorite Italian dressing, 8 to 12 minutes on the grill with some, and then at the end of it, put your favorite hard Italian grated cheese on there, serve them in a deep platter, and then release all that wonderful mushroom moisture mixed with the dressing and serve them on salad. Very simple, very wonderful, no cleanup. If you dry your shiitake, this is shiitake, but this is true of any mushroom that you have. Shiitake is just really good at it. So if you dry your shiitake in the sun, gill side up, you can increase the vitamin D content from 110 international units to 46,000 international units. Now that's fully dried gill side up. The gill side up gives more surface area for that reaction of ergosterol to vitamin D to happen. But you can do this with any mushroom you get in the grocery store. Bring it home, take it out of that terrible plastic package first of all. You can put it in a sunny windowsill if it's a nice day out on your deck for 10 to 20 minutes, and you will increase the vitamin D. It's a one-way reaction. Put it back in your refrigerator, and you're good to go. Which has more potassium? Mushrooms or bananas?
Since you're talking about mushrooms.
Consider the source, of course. Yes. Mushrooms are actually much higher in potassium than bananas. If you Google food sources of potassium, bananas are actually fairly low down on the list, although we eat them for potassium, and there's lots of other great reasons to eat bananas. One thing I learned though, watching a special on PBS on honey production, is that if you eat a lot of bananas, your body gives off something that pisses off the bees. And I garden a lot, and I actually just found a nest of black-eyed hornets in my garden, in my raised beds. So I don't eat bananas in like starting about February, I don't eat bananas until October. Mushrooms are a very high quality protein, having all the essential amino acids. Mushrooms contain indoles, such as serotonin, melatonin, all HCG, all indicated for improving mood and sleep. Mushrooms contain a lot of phenolic compounds, which include the flavonoids, phenolic acids, polyphenols, which are considered protective, as some studies have shown to have anti-aging effects, mostly due to being good dietary antioxidants. And mushrooms have a number of unique dietary antioxidants that you don't really get from other food. Terpenes and diterpenes are another example of that. So our king of the mushroom geek says it this way: mushrooms don't like to rot any more than we do. They produce these natural antibiotics. The mycelium produces these sweats of enzymes, and in those sweats are these very potent antibiotics that are antiviral, antibacterial, antiprotozoal, and antifungal. So there's one brilliant but kind of nutty guy, Trad Cotter, who's working, I think, out of North Carolina and also Jamaica, who got this idea. He grew mushrooms in these bags like we do. And if you look carefully in there, there's some liquid. And of course, that's the waste of the mushrooms. So they're, like us, they're taking in oxygen and giving out CO2. And they put out these waste products, these sweats of antibiotics and antivirals and other things. He got this idea that if he was getting sick, he would harvest his body fluids, and honestly, I didn't want to know too much about that, and inject them in the bag, and harvest a very particular medicine that was good for whatever was ailing him. Now, never in my wildest dreams would I have thought of doing that, but apparently it is, working its way into clinical trials. Very, very specialized and personalized medicine. So because our immune systems have evolved alongside fungal pathogens, we've developed the ability to recognize some of those components of cell walls, of course, as foreign. They give us trained immunity. By stimulating your immune response with one pathogen, you can strengthen it against infection with another. Beta-glucans do this. They don't actually cause disease in humans, but they generate these primed immune cells that respond to a variety of deadly infections. So just keeping your immune system toned and locked and loaded and ready for whatever challenges we're going to give it. this is important. There are at least 7 receptors on the surface of major classes of immune cells that bind specifically to mushroom cell wall components. So I tell people if they absolutely can't stand to eat any mushrooms, I first tell them, try all the different kinds of mushrooms. They all have a different flavor, they all have a different texture. There's many different ways to prepare them so you don't even know you're eating mushrooms. So I'd like people to eat mushrooms, but if you absolutely aren't gonna do that, then find a good mushroom supplement and take it. It's that important. So I don't know if any of you followed this story. It's kind of a gross slide. Protein found in hookworm soup could fight asthma and other autoimmune diseases. So people found that people with debilitating asthma and allergies who really couldn't function found that if they got infected by hookworms, their symptoms completely disappeared. So you know what happens, right? People went to Africa and walked barefoot through outdoor latrines to get infected with hookworm. Come on, can I get an EU at least? and then clinics sprang up in Mexico where you could go get infected with hookworm, and they finally realized that you could just, grow the worms, harvest the broth, and use the broth instead, and that's in clinical trials now. So mushrooms work in that way, but not as dramatically. And we've evolved with these parasites for tens of thousands of years, millions of years. We've cleaned up our environment to such an extent that we no longer have these challenges, but our immune systems are ready for that. And that's why sometimes they just overreact to things that they don't need to overreact to. So mushrooms can definitely help with that as well. Not as dramatically as getting infected with hookworms. Ew. So we already talked about this. The majority of mushroom polysaccharides are sugars with these bound protein components, and that's important. Most commonly are produced beta-glucans, but there are actually a wide range of sugars in lots of different configurations. So why are polysaccharide sugars good as opposed to bad sugars? Those beta linkages, as opposed to the alpha linkages in the other sugars like starch and white flour and sucrose, allow the mushroom polysaccharides to pass through your upper digestion into your lower digestion, where about 80% of your immune system is working. So they call this the second brain for a lot of reasons, because the things that are being made in your gut are communicating directly with your brain, like your vagus nerve. So it's really important to keep that population happy and well fed with things that they want to eat. Binding of these mushroom polysaccharides to different immune receptors triggers widespread immunological changes. And here's one, I skipped it here. So mushroom polysaccharides restore immune competency in people whose immune systems are compromised by stress, chronic illness, tumor burden, autoimmune conditions. So 30 years ago, I'd never heard of any of these things. Now I know individuals with each of these things. In fact, multiple individuals with some of these things. So it seems counterintuitive, and I get this question a lot. If something stimulates your immune system, wouldn't it be bad for somebody with autoimmune disease? That kind of makes sense. Mushrooms work by down-regulating the key components of the pro-inflammatory response. So some examples of chronic inflammation would be hay fever. I don't know about you, but as the climate is getting warmer here, my allergies get worse and longer. Gum disease, irritable bowel syndrome, plaque buildup in your arteries, rheumatoid arthritis. Those are just some examples. So the 4 horsemen of the medical apocalypse: coronary heart disease, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, may be riding the same steed, and that steed is inflammation. And this has become much more in the popular media than it ever has before. So I think most people have a basic understanding of chronic inflammation and the damage that it does. So it would be nice if there were a way to boost the part of the immune system that fights infection while down-regulating the part that results in chronic inflammation and all of those annoying symptoms. Mushrooms may just do the trick. And this is by a guy named Michael Greger in his book, How Not to Die, which I'm going to talk more about him in a little while. If you haven't followed him, he wrote How Not to Die, How Not to Diet, and his most recent book, How Not to Age. And I always learn something interesting. I can't sit still to read, so I always have a book in my ear. And I listen to his books multiple times because he's very entertaining, number one, but also just there's so much information. There's so much good information. So here's how it may work in the case of cancer. You get a wound or an infection, right? Your immune system triggers an inflammatory response. Rushing white blood cells to the seams to activate interleukins. And you've probably all done this. You get a little cut, you don't feel anything for a second or two, and then it starts to ooze and it starts to sting. That's the inflammatory response. Interleukins cause specialized proteins to the area. These proteins signal the cells of the wound site not to die, but to reproduce rapidly to heal the wound. That's all good. The infected cells reproduce until other chemistry signals them to stop. After about a week, the immune system downregulates the interleukins and proteins, causing an anti-inflammatory response. Chronic inflammation allows cancer cells to use the inflammatory response to grow rapidly, producing tumors. Mushrooms downregulate these interleukins, producing an anti-inflammatory response. So they're helping the inflammatory response, and then they're helping to downregulate the inflammatory response, which is very, very important. So take a look at this. We're going to see something like it again in a minute. Chronic inflammation has been linked to all of these disease states. All cancer stages, neurological diseases, diabetic complications, pulmonary disease, bone and joint disease, metabolic disorders, autoimmune disorders, cardiovascular disease. Chronic inflammation has been linked to all of these things. So as little as 200 years ago, we were an agrarian society. We grew a garden behind the house, we hunted for meat from the local forest, we scavenged for mushrooms and berries from the forest. Fruits and vegetables are imperative to a healthy diet, but what our modern society does not get is a regular supply of mushrooms. And there's lots of reasons for that, which I'm not going to go into today because we just don't have time. But it's an interesting history of why our culture here in the US are so microphobic, although I think that's changing. So we use general guides to microphobia and microphilia, which I'm not going to go too much in. But if you look at it, essentially, the microphobic places are places that were colonized by the Spanish and by the English. And they were in turn colonized by the Romans, who broke that traditional chain of knowledge and use of mushrooms. So, but not all ancients were in favor of mushrooms. We're going to hear more about this guy later. But Pliny the Elder was very anti-mushroom. And during the Reformation, when people were delving back into the ancient literature, he also added to the people's general dislike of mushrooms. So, claiming that the generative principle of the mushroom is in the slime and fermenting juices of the damp earth, or of the roots of the most glandiferous of trees, he wonders what great pleasure then can there be in the partaking of a dish of so doubtful a character as this. He had one notable exception to his dislike of mushrooms, which I'll talk about in a little while. But in general, there's a lack of research comparing different mushrooms and their medicinal benefits. Worse than that, mushrooms are often not included when those studies are being done. So, we as a company do get out and about, and we're sitting in the audience going, don't forget about the mushrooms. But here's what all mushrooms have. Mushroom polysaccharides, which we talked about, chitin, which we also talked about, proteins, and enzymes. All mushrooms have a degree of immunological activity, prebiotic activity, that is, they're feeding our good gut microbiome, antibacterial activity, antioxidant activity, and anti-inflammatory activity, all mushrooms to different degrees. So having to be both prebiotic and antimicrobial, and we talked about this already as well, because they're feeding a good gut microbiome. So you guys want to come closer?
We're fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Which brings me to ergothioneine, and I'll get through this quickly. It's important. I want everyone to know this. Dr. Beelman, who I introduced before, his license plate actually says ergo on it for ergothioneine, and he's done a lot of good work connecting soil health to human health through ergothioneine. And I'm sure there's lots more reasons behind that connection between good soil health and human health, but this is the one that's actually been proven and called out. Can't talk about ergothioneine without talking about glutathione. I'm going to talk a little bit about phosphatidylserine, spermidine, ergothioneine. Possible new vitamin. I think they decided not to call it a vitamin, but it could be because we don't make it ourselves, we have to get it from our food. In about 2005, we discovered that there's a transporter on every red blood cell in every mammal that takes ergothioneine from our food into the interior of the cell. So we knew it was important. It took us till 2012 to figure out what it was doing. But if every red blood cell in every mammal has it, we know it had to be important. It's a naturally occurring amino acid made by very few organisms. Mushrooms are one of the few. I have porcini there in the background. Have any of you ever had porcini mushrooms? So if you go to Italy and order pasta alla fungi, this is the fungi. So this is very commonly consumed in Italy, and it's a wonderful mushroom which we can't cultivate because it has to grow in association with trees. So I talked before about Dr. Beelman. I served on the board of directors in Central PA for a while, and I used to visit he and his wife, and one time they invited me to dinner. So I took a big box of all the mushrooms we grow as a hostess gift and gave it to Dr. Beelman, and he whipped it out of my hands, took it down and put it in his basement refrigerator, so no mushrooms for dinner that night. The next day he took them to the lab and analyzed them for ergothioneine, because that's what he was studying at the time. So these are some of his numbers. Lion's mane, very high ergothioneine. Gray oyster, very high in ergothioneine. Yellow oyster is even higher than gray oyster. I'm not sure why we don't have yellow on here. Shiitake, a good source. White button mushrooms. Next on the list, chicken liver. Not a big fan of working meat myself, but oat bran, black bean, red kidney bean. But by far the best source of ergothioneine in our diets is mushrooms. So here's estimated average ergothioneine consumption per day. Italy, way up there for a couple of different reasons. They eat a lot of porcini, but also they treat their agricultural soils really well. So if you spray Roundup in your fields, it's also a potent antibiotic, and you're killing off all the life in the soil, including the fungal networks that were producing ergothioneine for us, which is taken up by plants, and we could eat it as food. So the better you treat your agricultural soils, the more ergothioneine you have in your food. Ireland, their number one horticultural crop is mushrooms, but also they treat their agricultural soils well, and it's a great environment for fungi. Nice and wet, and just a beautiful environment for fungi. France, mushrooms are much more a part of their cuisine than they are here in the US. Finland, pretty low down, way at the bottom. Here we are in the US, way at the bottom. We don't get enough ergothioneine. Again, these are Dr. Beelman's slides. Alzheimer's dementia rate versus blood ergothioneine. There's a very strong correlation between blood ergothioneine and Alzheimer's and dementia. Correlation is not causation, but it's something we should be taking note of. Alzheimer's, dementia, I asked Dr. Beelman to add Japan in there, because when we went to Japan to learn how to grow some of these mushrooms, we had mushrooms and fish at every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Honestly, by the time I got back on the plane, I was like, I just want a scrambled egg. But being way in the back in the cattle call section, there were no Western meals left by the time they got to me, so I had one more good Japanese meal with mushrooms and fish. And sure enough, Japan tops us all. Parkinson's disease death rate, the same thing. And again, Japan, right there. There's lots of other reasons. They have healthier diets and a healthier lifestyle, essentially, than we do. Life expectancy in general. There's a correlation between blood ergothioneine and lifespan. Glutathione. I said I couldn't talk about ergothioneine without talking about glutathione. Glutathione is very interesting, very small molecule that's produced by the body, and we get it from our food, found in every cell. It's the most important antioxidant because it's within the cell, so it's protecting our cellular health. Glutathione tends to mirror ergothioneine content. So this looks familiar, right? It looks just like the chronic inflammation slide, except this is free radicals, all linked to the same, the same disease states. Oxidative stress triggers inflammation. Inflammation triggers oxidative stress. And you get on that treadmill and you just keep going round and round. There's probably some people here who understand what I mean by that. If you look at a hospital situation, people have cancer, AIDS, other very serious diseases. Almost invariably they are depleted in glutathione. The reasons for this aren't completely understood, but we know that glutathione is absolutely essential for maintaining intercellular health. That's what ergothioneine is doing. Ergothioneine is keeping glutathione stable. So once you take on some ergothioneine, it resides in your body for about a month. So you need to be constantly replenishing your supply of ergothioneine. So if you've got a broken arm or a serious disease you're fighting, this adaptive antioxidant is going to the place of most need, leaving your brain and your other vital organs unprotected. So it's really important to have enough ergothioneine on board to keep your glutathione stable. Which brings me to phosphatidylserine. I love this. Horse mushrooms, which would be equivalent to portobello, have the highest concentrations, 8.7% dry weight of phosphatidylserine, a chemical that boosts brain function of any mushroom, making it of likely interest to formulators. I read this in this fabulous book, which I know we have up in the store, called The Fungal Pharmacy, and I read it on a coast-to-coast flight. It's a really interesting read, and I had never heard of phosphatidylserine before I read that, and so I Googled it, as one does, to find out what it is and what it's doing. It's this fatty substance produced in the body that covers and protects every cell, and it's involved in the clotting function of the body. It's particularly vital for the proper functioning of nerve cells within the brain. So I got a Dr. Axe's website. I don't know if you've heard of him. I've seen him on public radio or public television, and he has this popular website. So his top 6 benefits, of course, he's selling a supplement of phosphatidylserine, may improve symptoms of Alzheimer's, aids in the slowdown of age-related cognitive decline, combats depression, improves Parkinson's disease symptoms. He uses this, treats ADHD symptoms, which I think is pretty strong language to say treats, but I mean, look at me, and I eat a lot of mushrooms. Boosts athletic performance. So a recommended dosage, again, uses the word treating, for treating Alzheimer's would be 100 milligrams 3 times a day for a total of 300 milligrams. So if my calculations are correct, then 1 or 2 mushrooms a day would provide that dosage. So if you like mushrooms, it's pretty cheap insurance. I could find very little information on phosphatidylserine content, but I keep my eye on it to see, to see if that will come out. So foods high in phosphatidylserine. Soy lecithin is very high in phosphatidylserine. And if you've ever heard of the company Bulk Supplements, you can get like a pound of the stuff for under $30, and the dosage is about a quarter teaspoon a day. It's very inexpensive. So if you do smoothies or sprinkle it on your cereal, it's a very inexpensive way to get your phosphatidylserine. The next one down is bovine brain, chicken heart, mackerel, horse mushrooms, or portobellos would be a very good source of phosphatidylserine. So have any of you seen this advertised by the lady who was hosting Jeopardy for a while? Nariva, brain performance. It's time to brain better. So I was super curious about this. So for $60 a month, this is what you get. You get some B vitamins, some coffee fruit extract, 100 milligrams of phosphatidylserine. So mushrooms are way less expensive than that and tastier as well. So I mentioned this guy, How Not to Age. I asked for this book for Christmas 2 years ago from my dear husband, and he got it for me. And I read it, and I learned about spermidine. Spermidine was discovered by Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, the father of the microscope. So when a guy discovers a microscope, what do you think he looks at? You know he's got to look at his sperm. And then you know he has to leave it around his lab for 1 to 2 years. Yeah, a year or 2, and it formed crystals. And he called those crystals spermidine. It was independently discovered in 1885 and renamed neurodine. Unfortunately, it had to revert back to its original name, which is why we haven't heard more about it, because you can imagine the headlines, right? For a healthy, long life, what are you going to do? Anyway, not going to go there. So spermidine plays a critical role in regulating cell growth. It's a positively charged molecule that naturally binds with our DNA, which is negatively charged, fits neatly into the groove of both the major and the minor helixes, stabilizing our genetic code for proper translation. And remember I said before that we turn ourselves over every year. So what happens when proper cell division goes wrong? We get all these millions of little proto-cancers, which then can develop into cancers. So it's really important that translation goes accurately. So mice fed extra spermidine lived 25% longer lives and lived more healthy lives. This has been consistent across every species tested so far. Spermidine levels decline with age. Up to about 30, we make enough for ourselves. After that, we need to get it from our diet. We obtain it in 3 ways. We make it from the amino acid arginine. Certain of our gut bacteria make it, another reason to treat those guys well, and certain foods are high in it. healthy diet would contain 25 milligrams a day for women and 30 milligrams a day for men. Americans get on average 8 milligrams a day. You can see why that would be a problem, right? So, spermidine-rich foods fall into 3 categories. Unprocessed plant foods, certain fermented foods, and I have tempeh there in the background because tempeh is the highest food they found so far with the most spermidine in it. And select animal viscera, which again I'm just not such a fan of. So food sources, again, this is from Dr. Greger's book. Per 100 gram servings unless otherwise noted. Tempeh, way up there at the top. The next are white button mushrooms. So white button mushrooms often don't get their due because we think, why should we bother with white button mushrooms when we can have all the specialty mushrooms that are now available? White button mushrooms do this better than any other mushroom. So it'd be a good reason if you stopped eating white button mushrooms to maybe put them back in your rota because they are a really good source of spermidine. Pig pancreas next on the list. Natto, any of you familiar with natto? It's this super goopy, slimy, stinky Japanese condiment that some people really love, and I tried it at a Japanese restaurant with a fan of it. I was like, yeah, yuck, but I know it's really good for me. So I tried to grow some at home in my food dryer. Yeah, my family almost threw me out. It took us like a week to get rid of the smell. It was pretty awful. So if you love natto, that's also a good source. Mango is a good source. Edamame, green peas, aged cheddar cheese, at least aged a year. That was good news. Lentil soup, soybeans, all good sources of spermidine. Sterols, especially ergosterol, have activity against a number of tumors and have been reported to have anti-aging activity on par with resveratrol, which of course red wine is best known for, so have a glass of red wine with your mushrooms. Lovastatin is produced by many mushrooms because it's a very strong antifungal. Oyster mushrooms are especially good at that. So it has the same cholesterol-lowering compounds as pharmaceuticals, but without the liver toxicity. So how do you get your Kaolin medicinal mushrooms every day? I say eat them. But don't buy those. Whenever I go into a grocery store, I always look at the mushrooms. And I found this at a Whole Foods in, I even forget where I was, somewhere in Michigan. And those oyster mushrooms are completely grown over with bacteria. So look at your mushrooms carefully before you buy them. Don't buy those either. This website, thekitchen.com, did a good study on how best to store mushrooms, and what they concluded is in a paper bag is the best way, or in a bowl with a paper towel, somewhere where they can breathe. So if you store them in a paper bag in your refrigerator, they'll continue to get drier and drier, they're still fine to eat. But if you leave them in the plastic and they get bacterial overgrowth and slimy, they are no longer safe to eat. So store your mushrooms in paper, cloth, a bowl with paper towels. Don't seal them in with their own moisture. I always get this question, what serving size do you need to get the benefits of mushrooms? So the serving size according to the USDA is 84 grams. Not really sure why 84 grams, but there's 84 grams of white button mushrooms. Not overwhelming, right? Sliced up raw, they're about a cup. If you cook them, it's about half a cup. So it's not many mushrooms that you need to eat to get good benefits from mushrooms. In some cases, extracts are called for. There are a lot of medicinal mushrooms, like I said, that are really good medicinals, but you don't want to eat them because it'd be like chewing on a little tire, which of course I've never tried, but they look like that. Or they're just so hard, you can't eat them or you can't digest them. They have to be processed in some way. And that process is usually an extract of some kind. So two major types of extracts, water and alcohol. There's many others, but this is what you can do in your kitchen. So my kids growing up, they wouldn't eat mushrooms on fat. So at the beginning of every cold and flu season, I'd make a big pot of mushroom stock, pour it into ice cube trays, put those ice cubes in the freezer, just sneak them into whatever I was cooking. So they were getting the good benefits and they didn't know it. Doing good deeds by stealth. You can make this real cheap and dirty alcohol extract, but I used fresh mushrooms and cheap vodka, and I put a lot of shiitake in there. Shiitakes are very high in sulfur compounds, which are super healthy, but in cheap vodka, it tasted awful. So if you're gonna make that if you make like vodka sauce for your pasta and want to infuse mushrooms into your vodka, use a better class of vodka and don't use shiitake mushrooms. But generally, I don't do that way anymore. I do everything. I'm much more scientific about it now. So the hot water extract gives you high polysaccharides and low triterpenes. Alcohol gives you high triterpenes and low polysaccharides. So you can do both, extract them in alcohol, then extract them in water, recombine them to get the full profile. I usually do them separately because you do get more benefit if you start fresh with fresh mushrooms in each. And I do use fresh mushrooms as opposed to dried, only because I can't see the point of putting all that energy into drying and grinding them up when I can just put them in a blender with Everclear and do it that way. It's just a lot easier. And then you also already then have the water from the mushrooms and you have a full extract by the time you're done. Which brings me to lion's mane, one of my favorites. Also called pom-pom, lion's mane, satyr's beard, hedgehog. Hericium arenaceus is the most common one, but there's other ones we grow as well. Lion's mane, its bumper sticker is nature's nutrient for the neurons. So it's a triple threat at least, again, for neurodegeneration and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, neuropathy, dementia, etc. They have these hericinones and ericinines, which I'll talk about. They have a lot of riboflavin, which I already talked about, and they have this dialynylate phosphatidylethanol. Say that twice. Which is very closely related to phosphatidylserine and serves much the same function. Ericinine is a potent anticonvulsant that can be neuroprotective in epilepsy and stroke, as well as brain and spinal cord injuries. I've had this slide in my deck for years, and I never would have put it together with a possible cure for epilepsy. But there's this wonderful woman named Sarah Kate, who has a daughter, Lily Kate, who had treatment-resistant epilepsy. So she was having, between 40 and 50 seizures a day, and she could not thrive. She could go to school, but she had to sleep in the back of the classroom because she had so many seizures, and she had to have her seizure dog with her. And she was so exhausted all the time that she mostly slept through the day. So her mom, being an amazing individual for lots of reasons, did a lot of research and came upon a formulation of medicinal mushrooms she thought might help her daughter. So she and her husband took them just to make sure that they could tolerate them and didn't do them any harm. And it made them feel better, it made them feel better than usual. So they tried it with Lily and put her epilepsy into remission. So the website is lilieslighthouse.org if you're interested, or if you have friends, family who have epilepsy. 1 in 72 Americans has some form of epilepsy, which I was appalled when I heard that number. I had no idea. So they're fundraising to get this into clinical trials, to get it into the hands of doctors, so doctors can recommend this and have the scientific papers and evidence to back it up. So it's just can't possibly hurt, and it's done so much good. And we've been working with Lilies Lighthouse for 3 years now, 4 years. But here's what I find most exciting about pom-pom. And this is one that I actually take every day. Even though we grow it and I eat it, I take a supplement because you need the mycelium and the mushroom. So we carry Ohm supplements here, and they have both the fruity body and the mycelium. So you have to read your labels carefully when you buy supplements so you know what you're getting. These hericinones have been found to induce synthesis of nerve growth factor, which are required by the brain for developing and maintaining important sensory neurons. So that's part of its tagline, nature's nutrients for the neurons. One study in Japan of 100 patients suffering from various nerve disorders like Parkinson's, diabetic neuropathy, spinal cord injuries, had 5 grams of pom-pom in soup once a day, which is not a lot. 5 grams of pom-pom is not very much. For 6 months, and 6 out of 7 showed measurable improvement in perceptual capacity and functional independence. And isn't that what we all want from the people we love? Another study on men and women aged 50 to 80 with mild cognitive problems showed improvement at 8, 12, and 16 weeks, taking 1 gram of pom-pom 3 times a day. Again, not a lot, but you have to keep taking it. I found that when I run out, I can tell the difference. So what pom-pom helps me with is verbal and locational memory. Like, I rarely lose anything anymore. I remember where I left my keys. I remember where I put my daughter's diploma in the attic. You know, it just really helps me with locational and verbal memory. And I find when I run out in about 3 weeks, I start to lose my words and my keys. Because of its mild attenuating effect on nerve and cerebral cells, it shows some promise as a therapy for multiple sclerosis and other degenerative nerve disorders. I'm not going to bore you with this, but there's that phosphatidylethanolamin, a very important membrane phospholipid. Diamyl phosphatidylethanolamin. Can anybody say it now? Diamyl phosphatidylethanolamin from Hericium aeruginosus protects against endoplasmic reticulum stress-dependent neurotube cell death via this pathway. In many types of neurodegeneration, neuronal cell death is induced by this endoreticulum stress. Hence, any products that can reduce that stress are going to be beneficial. We can't synthesize this. It has to be obtained from the diet, and you can obtain it from Hericium. Again, I'm not going to bore you with all this because I like this story, and my husband loves this story. A 2010 human trial of 30 women looked at Hericium baked in cookies versus placebo cookies in general would make me feel better, and how they affect menopause, depression, sleep quality, and my favorite and my husband's favorite, indefinite complaints. There's actually an index for that. So looking at the following scales: Cooperman Menopausal Index, Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale, Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and Indefinite Complaints Index. Indefinite Complaint Index and depression were significantly lower than at the start of the trial. So I thought this was really interesting. It wasn't a big bunch of people, but again, it's a delicious culinary mushroom. You should get some. Phillips has done a lot of work with recipe development for this one, and they have some wonderful recipes on how to use lion's mane in your kitchen. Concentration, irritated, and anxious tend to be lower than a placebo group, especially the irritated part. Although my husband has to answer for some of that, I think. A few more benefits of eating lion's mane, but by no means a complete list, and I'll whip through this. Inhibits metastasis of cancer cells to the lung, promote neuronal growth after crushing injuries, protective against diabetic neuropathy, and we've had people come to these talks and either eat more of the mushrooms or get a supplement, and they come back maybe 6 weeks later and they're like, it's miraculous. They just don't have any more neuropathy. So it doesn't work with everybody in every case, but it seems to be really helpful for some people. Increasing the rate of repair of flesh wounds. Contributes to fat burning, always popular. So it's a wonderful mushroom to eat. And here's some of the few things you can do with it. And they have recipe cards up at the store. Ask for them if you can't find them. Pom-pom bake, this wonderful recipe that Phillips came up with. Pom-pom mushroom crostini. Isn't that delicious? Pom-pom lobster roll, and it's a wonderful fake crab or lobster. Pom-pom crab cakes. Faux pom-pom clam chowder. Pom-pom stuffed portobellos with roasted tomato sauce. I did this one for a cooking show a few years ago in a vegan form, and it was wonderful. Garlic broiled pom-pom on toast with sage. It's almost lunchtime, isn't it? I like to do them as chips. I have royal trumpet here and lion's mane. Paint them with olive oil, sprinkle with sea salt, bake them. And they look kind of ugly, but they taste delicious. The other really simple thing that I've learned to do, and even my very conservative Italian husband will eat this as a meat. If you cut the lion's mane into steaks, use Montreal steak seasoning, paint it with olive oil so it sticks. Olive oil in your pan and sear them. It's really, really good and very, very simple. Which brings me to our royal trumpet. This one's got a lot of names. It's been with us for a very long time. Royal trumpet, king oyster, carnicello, cardincelli, king trumpet, French horn, boletus of the steppes. It's also called poor man's porcini sometimes because it has the wonderful texture of a porcini mushroom, but not the same taste. Trumpet royale, alie oyster. So Pleurotus syringae is native to central Puglia, Italy, and the broader Mediterranean region, and that's where cultivation started. It grows wild on the roots of the Mediterranean sea holly, Eryngium bourgati, hence Pleurotus eryngium, that's where it gets its name. Because it is an oyster mushroom, but it has a different shape, a different taste, and that's where it was originally found and cultivated. It was once called Sons of Thunder by local shepherds, possibly because it would come up after a rainstorm. The cardincello, also known as the king trumpet, has a history in Italy that dates back to ancient Roman times with Pliny the Elder mentioning it, and they said I would come back to Pliny the Elder. This was the only mushroom he considered that people should eat. But cardincello has been prized since medieval times. They were considered an aphrodisiac, and therefore the church strongly discouraged eating them because, I don't know. So these have many, many benefits. A lot of them paralleling the benefits of oyster mushrooms in general. But cholesterol and liver damage, they have lots of ergothioneine, good for bone health, and this is something I learned by listening to a conversation at a mushroom conference. One super duper mushroom expert had sent some to another, to Paul Stamets actually, because Paul Stamets had fallen off his roof and broken something, he needed to mend his bones. And so this guy sent him a special powder of royal trumpet to help him mend his bones after falling off his roof. Anti-inflammatory, insulin resistance, anti-cancer, antioxidant, and allergies. So bone metabolism. Alleviated the decrease in trabecular bond mineral density. Translation, it may be beneficial for preventing osteoporosis. I spent a lot of time translating what I read so that I can understand it. Royal trumpet contains about 0.4 to 2 milligrams based on dry weight. The mycelium contains a lot of ergothioneine. It's an anti-inflammatory, so it can provide some relief from symptoms of inflammation and pain, like pharmaceutical COX inhibitors, like NSAIDs, like aspirin, and ibuprofen. This P, and they actually call it P, which is unfortunate, may provide some insights into mechanisms and possible prevention and treatment of allergic and inflammatory responses. And I kind of have an explanation, but this one I found very difficult to understand. So I'm just going to have to take their word for it. So essentially that it inhibits allergy markers. So otherwise, I don't understand much of what's on that slide. Any medical professionals in the room here who can help me out? Drug therapy, pardon?
I'm a veterinarian.
Oh.
Mast cells produce histamine,
Okay.
so I think it's downregulating histamine
Okay.
release.
Which I can do a better slide using that instead of.
I mean, that was my 5-second
Yes.
scan
Okay.
of what it said.
Oyster mushrooms are very well known for lowering cholesterol, and these are no exception. They have very high dietary fiber, providing that, feeding your good gut microbiome. This is being sold right now in the U.S. at Target and Walmart. So I'm going to go find some and give it a try. It's Rowe's homemade marinara with cardincelli. And I can't say that I've ever seen cardincelli in an American grocery store. I think we should change that. We can talk about that later. Then there's all these wonderful snacks, they call them in Italy, of cardincello packed in olive oil and herbs. And I'm going to try that myself because it looks wonderful. Yes?
Cardincelli are the oyster,
Cardincelli are the royal trumpets.
the what?
The royal trumpets.
Okay.
Or cardincello, it's sometimes called, and lots of other names there. So I like them sliced up, marinated in a Japanese, and we learned to do this in Japan, marinated in olive oil, balsamic vinegar, soy sauce, and some garlic, and on the grill, and they're absolutely delicious. You can use them to make these scallops, and they make really good kind of fake scallops. And of course, as we know, we have the gentleman from Bandit Cheese here sampling some of this vegan cheese made with our mushrooms. And that's all I have to say. Unless you guys have some questions? Yes.
If you could only eat one mushroom, which one would it be?
It's like asking me to choose between my children.
Who's your favorite child?
I would say, I really love it. Just in that simple steak with the Montreal steak seasoning, or shredded up and used in any number of ways. But I actually eat it. I love all the mushrooms and I eat them all. Yeah. And so I encourage people who don't like mushrooms to try all the different mushrooms and try cooking them in all different ways.
Can you overcook the nutrients out of them?
The only way you can do that is if you boil them and throw the water away.
Okay.
So
So like throwing them on the grill like you just described is.
that's absolutely fine. And I mentioned that you should cook mushrooms. Just get more out of mushrooms when you cook them than when you eat them raw.
Okay.
It's certainly not gonna hurt you if you eat a lot of raw mushrooms. It's gonna give you bad gas and you don't get as much good out of them.
So in Iowa, when we go to a grocery store, the only mushrooms there are the white buttons.
I say nag your produce manager. I always tell people that because these mushrooms are available all across the country. And if you want them, just make sure you nag your produce manager till you get what you want.
So
Or try your local farmer's market. There's a lot of small growers who are growing the specialties.
They do have.
But don't throw the white button ones out either, because as we learned today, those are actually really, really beneficial.
in springtime, we go out and hunt for morel mushrooms,
Yeah,
but they're $30 a pound.
right. But also, it has incredible medicinal, nutritional benefits as well. Yeah. Yes.
That was a lot of great information, Tina. Where can people learn more if they want to continue to expand their education methods?
There's lots of great YouTube videos. There's lots of great books, which you can find up in the store. We've curated our book selection pretty carefully so that there's really good ones up there that you can learn more. Also about cooking them too.
Is it possible to grow our own
Absolutely.
lines? I mean,
Yeah, in fact, I think you can get a kit at the store and bring them home. Bring the kit home and grow them at home.
So what is that soil?
It's based on Northern Appalachian red oak sawdust, but they'll grow on any number of different hardwood sawdust. Yeah. So sawdust supplemented with grain. So there's several kinds of grains that you can supplement with as well. And if you have access to an autoclave, of course you can do it for yourself.
Grain as in like wheat?
There might be wheat in there. Some of our formulations call for wheat bran, but some don't. So, you can use corn byproducts, wheat oats. I mean, there's all different kinds of byproducts. No questions? Yes.
Mushroom broth, do you recommend like certain mushrooms to actually use for making mushroom broth?
All of them. Like in fact, whatever you trim off the mushrooms that you don't eat, yeah, put them in a broth. Absolutely.
Does that, over time, does that get less,
Okay.
like if you make a broth, is it less effective over time or less helpful over time?
I keep it in my freezer, and actually a good mushroom tea will last in your freezer potency for 1 or 2 years, 3 years, depending on what mushrooms are in there. So I make a mushroom decoction and really concentrated mushroom tea. So I make the mushroom tea and then cook it down to a fifth, so it's very, very concentrated. I keep that in the freezer. It has a potency for 3 to 5 years in my freezer. Yes.
Okay, so you're not an advocate of the dried mushrooms.
Oh, absolutely.